Morning, everybody. We'd like to get started. And I'd like to invite our graduating class to sit up in the front, since our graduation address will be directed particularly to them. So this is a wonderful day. Graduation 2017. This afternoon, our graduates are going to get their diplomas. And as our president, Peter Salovey, said to Stevie Wonder when he presented him with his honorary degree this year, sign, seal, deliver, it's yours. No, it's a wonderful day. For our faculty, it's hard not to go back to think about the days when we were interviewing the group that would become this year's graduating class. How much thought, time, and effort, how many people we spoke to, how many times I had to wear a suit. And it's a labor of love. The residency is in some ways the lifeblood of our department. And each person who joins the residency represents for our faculty the hopes and dreams that we have for the whole field of psychiatry. And that endowment of our graduates with our hopes and dreams turns out to be well repaid as we as faculty learn from, take pleasure in, and then stand back and marvel at the accomplishments of our residents through every year of the residency program and then on into their careers. So this is really a very special day for us as faculty as much as it is a special day, I'm sure, for the graduates and their families. So it's wonderful to get together. It's hard, though, on a day like today to ignore what's going on outside in the world. The 13 wise men, the senators who were too male, too frail, too pale, have come up with exactly the product that we were very afraid that they might. That they've come up with a Senate bill for the reform of health care that our friend and supporter, Senator Chris Murphy, calls an evil bill, an evil bill. It would cap Medicaid, it would phase out subsidies, and in so doing disenfranchise the older, the poor, the disabled. And it would shift the burden of care for the unfunded delivery of care to the hospitals, many of which are teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. And for us as people who deliver mental health care, it's really important that we understand that one of the main tenets of this bill is to undo 10 years of parity legislation, to deprive women of assurances that their maternal care would be supported, and deprive people with mental illness and their families of assurances that states would be obligated to deliver mental health treatment. And the icing on the cake, if you consider this cake, is that it would eliminate the tax on people of means that support Medicaid. In other words, it's pretty transparently a transfer of money from people who are poor to people of means. And that's exactly the way that President Obama has described this, not as a health bill, but as a money bill. And it's you may think this is a great idea, and if you do, I respect the differences of opinion in the department, but I am deeply troubled by this. And it's exactly the kind of proposal that I discussed last week in terms of the reasons that we have to be more engaged in what's going on in society and what's going on in the world around us, and advocate for the people that we serve. So that makes today's Grand Rounds even more meaningful. So our graduating class every year selects people, a graduation speaker, who speaks to the zeitgeist of the moment, speaks to their values and aspirations. And this year, they've chosen a hero. And what do I mean by hero? Well, I'm using hero in the way that Joseph Campbell, the anthropologist, did in the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Hero is someone who ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder, where fabulous forces are there encountered and a decisive victory is won. The hero then comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons upon, and I changed the wording a little bit, her fellow humans. So this description aptly describes our graduation speaker today, Kay Redfield Jamison. Kay is an endowed professor at Johns Hopkins. She's co-director of the mood disorders there. She has an honorary professorship at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She's incredibly productive and has had a tremendous impact on the field. She's published 7 books, numerous papers, is engaged in many leadership and advisory roles for NIH, for national advocacy organizations, and other groups. She's been called a hero of medicine by Time magazine. PBS included her in the Great Minds of Medicine. The MacArthur Foundation awarded her one of their Genius Fellowship Awards. She's received the Falcone Prize from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. She's given honorary lectures at numerous universities. She received the William Styron Award for the National Mental Health Association. And at Yale, she received the McGovern Award for Medical Communication, and we awarded her our Mental Health Research Advocacy Award in 2011. On top of all this, she's received 7 honorary degrees that I know of. Maybe it's more now. So what is the supernatural experience that she is confronted in her life? I would say one part of that is her confrontation with her own bipolar disorder. And like all heroes, the question is, in a way, not what challenge you are faced with, but what you do with it. And one of the things that she did with it that was incredibly courageous and impactful was to share her experience with society. In her book, An Unquiet Mind, in which she describes this work, was a transformative work in education for our entire society, both practitioners, consumers, families, advocates. And then she has what I will use metaphorically, use the term metaphorically, a bipolar pattern of books. What I mean by that, a serious book about illness. Then a profound, and I would say the classic textbook or book on manic depressive illness with Fred Goodwin. Then an artistic inspirational book about the interface of manic depressive illness and artistic temperament, Touched with Fire, classic now. Then a serious book, Night Falls Fast, which is one of the most moving and insightful books written about suicide. Then an inspirational book, Exuberance, The Passion for Life. And then, again, a deep and meaningful book, Nothing Was the Same, about her relationship with Richard Judd Wyatt, particularly as he was dying of cancer. Richard was a friend of many of ours working in the area of schizophrenia research. And then her new book, which is about the poet Robert Lowell setting the river on fire, which is gotten incredible reviews. And I just quote one, which is kind of nice. That brings us back to the issue of being heroes, taking responsibility and advocacy. So they say, right, this person says, there are no half measures to K. Redfield Jamison's medico-biographical study. It is impassioned, intellectually thrilling, and it demands that readers re-examine their own beliefs about art, madness, and moral responsibility. So with that, I will welcome our graduation speaker today, Dr. K. Redfield Jamison. Thank you.
Well, I don't mind leaving that up there. But okay. Thank you. I'm really delighted to be back at Yale. I love this place, and I'm very honored to be asked to speak today. Don't worry, I think I was listed to speak for an hour. There's no way I'm going to speak for an hour. You couldn't bear it. I couldn't bear it. And it's not going to be a traditional grand rounds. I really would just like to talk a little bit about, later in my talk about, oops. Okay, that's actually not my talk, but thank you. It's just that this one leads up to the third slide, which is an audio slide of Robert Lowell reading a poem that I'm going to introduce in the middle of my talk. So I am going to be talking later in my talk about Robert Lowell. I had the great privilege and delight of spending the last 6 years in his company, actually since I was 17 when I had my first breakdown. My English teacher in high school suggested that I might like Robert Lowell's poems, and I did indeed. So he's been with me a long time, but in a very focused writing sense, studying writing sense for the last 6 years. It's been the great intellectual pleasure of my life to do this book, far and away my favorite book. He's an immensely interesting man and courageous man, so I want to get to that in a bit. In much wisdom is much grief, it says in Ecclesiastes. That's disconcerting, especially at graduation, a time of high promise and celebration. Yet all of you have a notion of what is meant by the Old Testament words. You all have known some form of adversity and some suffering. Some of you have known these things far too well. I would like to talk to you today about three things that weave together: adversity, courage, and compassion, about how dark times contain within them an essential truth about how we come to know who we are and how adversity changes who you are as doctors. We come to adversity in different ways: through grief or heartbreak and love, through illness or mental suffering, through the death of a patient, a parent, or a friend. Pain and setback in life are, of course, inevitable. Adversity introduces us to our limitations and leads us to a more sympathetic, keener understanding of the human condition. It gives rise to a greater understanding of what it means to be a good doctor. Artists, like physicians, albeit in quite different ways, have taken adversity to advantage since they first began to write or draw or compose. 200 years ago, Shelley addressed the wisdom that comes from suffering. In a poem about his friend Lord Byron, madness, and himself, Shelley wrote, "Most wretched men are cradled into poetry by wrong. They learn in suffering what they teach in song." John Keats, who had trained to be a surgeon, agreed. And it should be added that it's very interesting to read John Keats's surgical notes, because there will be anatomical drawings from his lectures in London, and then there will be little drawings of flowers, and then there will be little snippets of poems. But he did start off as a surgeon. "Do you not see," he said, "how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul, a place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways. Adversity alone does not guarantee good art or being a good doctor. Often pain is only pain and nothing more. But combine suffering with imagination and with discipline, and it becomes possible to create lasting and sustaining art, become a great healer or a great teacher of medicine, or become the kind of person whom others bank on. Suffering fundamentally changes our expectations and beliefs about the nature, the duration, and the meaning of life and human nature. It reveals, as only pain can do, the fragility and the resolve of the human species. Many writers have described their periods of despair, how they struggled or dealt with them, and how they used the remembrance of suffering in their work. The influence of pain's dominion fills novels, canvases, and musical scores. There is no shortage of portrayals. Poet Anne Sexton described it this way: "I myself alternate between hiding behind my own hands, protecting myself any way possible, and this seeing, ouching other. I guess I mean that creative people must not avoid the pain that they get dealt. Hurt must be examined like a plague." Robert Lowell, a poet I will be talking about later, wrote about seeing too much and feeling it with one skin layer missing. And Virginia Woolf explored the double edge of emotions she experienced in her long periods of depression. "But it is always a question whether I wish to avoid these glooms," she wrote. "These 9 weeks give one a plunge into deep waters, which is alarming, but full of interest. There is an edge to it which I feel is of great importance. One goes down into the well, and nothing protects one from the assault of truth." Depression and suffering force a view of reality neither sought nor welcome, that looks out onto the fleeting nature of life and man's pale role in the history of the universe. So too, death, tightly woven into the life work of doctors, has been mused to countless writers. Indeed, for John Keats, physician and poet, death was life's high meed, its reward. "Verse, fame, and beauty are intense indeed," he wrote, "but death intenser. Death is life's high meed." A young Edgar Allan Poe, I can't write about Poe being from Hopkins in Baltimore. A young Poe wrote of the likewise inexplicable appeal and benefits of pain. And by a strange alchemy of brain, his pleasure always turned to pain. His naivete to wild desire, his wit to love, his wine to fire. And so, being young and dipped in folly, I fell in love with melancholy. To the extent that an individual, be they an artist or a doctor, can transform pain into an experience with more universal meaning, his or her own journey becomes one that they and others can value and use and teach. So let me turn now to the life, courage, and suffering of Robert Lowell, an exceedingly good-looking man, as you can see, which led him into a certain number of problems in his life. Born in Boston, arguably one of the great, if not the great, poet of the 20th century, American poet. One critic said about Lowell's poetry that it will be read as long as men remember English. Lowell, born in 1917 into a prominent New England family, was a poet of astonishing originality and influence. Twice awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, awarded every other poetry prize that was available in his time, his writing left its work and mark on a century. Lowell, who throughout his life suffered from the time he was a young adolescent, arguably as a child, from severe mental illness, was hospitalized more than 20 times for psychotic mania. He wrote, and these were days, of course, early on when mania, you were in the hospital 3, 4, 5, 6 months at a time. Each of these psychotic manias would be followed by a depression. So a good chunk of his life, and these were almost annual events. So he was sick a lot of his life, very sick. Lowell once wrote that darkness honestly lived through is a place of wonder and life. So much has come from there. When he wrote this, it was October 1957, and he was 40 years old, writing poetry like a house afire, as he put it, and taking darkness into new country. It was, he said, the best writing he had done. His new work became the heart of life studies, described by many critics as the most influential book of modern verse since T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. The poems, many intensely personal, several about his madness, were written at the boil in a few months' time. They left their mark. They have made a conquest, wrote a reviewer. They have won a major expansion of the territory of poetry. In December, after his summer and fall blaze of writing, Lowell was admitted, violently manic, to a mental hospital in Boston. It was his 5th psychiatric hospitalization in 8 years, and he was hospitalized then in a row 3 times. Lowell told the psychiatrist who admitted him to the hospital that the preceding months had been his most productive months of writing poetry. It was a pattern he had come to know well. First, the weeks of intense, fiery writing, then the spike into mania, and finally, as night follows day, the dust in the blood of depression. In his medical chart, Lowell's psychiatrist described a pattern many of his doctors were to observe. The patient has had a series of breaks, she wrote, all in light of unusual literary output. Much had come from the darkness, but not without a cost. One of the poems Lowell wrote while he was in the hospital, Writing in the Blue, speaks to the cold, equalizing horror of madness, the terror that his mania would return, as it always did, and the limits of privilege. He, like his fellow patients at McLean, that's one of those little hospitals to the north, he, like his fellow patients at McLean, was just one more, quote, Mayflower screwball. An ancestry of insanity obliterated his ancestry of Boston aristocracy. So if I could kindly turn, yeah.
Ready? Waking in the blue. Azure day makes my agonized blue window bleaker. Crows maunder on the petrified fairway. Absence. My heart grows tense as though a harpoon was sparring for the kill. This is the house for the mentally ill. Cock of the walk, I strut in my turtle-necked French sailor's jersey before the metal shaving mirrors, and see the shaky future grow familiar in the pinched indigenous faces of these thoroughbred mental cases, twice my age and half my weight. We're all old-timers. Each of us holds a locked razor.
How do I turn that off? Just, can I do this?
Wait.
Sorry. Lowell was an incredibly powerful poet. He wrote some astonishingly beautiful poetry at the end of his life, and the last book of his life was literally heartbreaking in terms of an elegy for a life. But it was a life he fought for and wide opened. Mania and imagination may at times come together to create great art. But what I was interested in Lowell, and when I started to write about him, I decided I didn't want to just write about mania and imagination and creativity and art and science or any of the other kinds of creative accomplishments that there are. I really wanted, and there actually is a huge recent literature on this, of very large studies of looking at the relationship between art and work. I wanted to look at that with Lowell, but I also wanted to look at the role of character, because I think anyone, when I ran the mood disorders clinic at UCLA, one of the things that I was always struck by is I think anybody who deals with any kind of illness is struck by is that some patients would have really relatively mild forms of mood disorders and be completely demoralized and go to the sidelines of life. And other people with absolutely seemingly paralyzingly psychotic forms of illness would get back into the fray. And I was interested in that in Lowell because I feel very strongly that we don't talk about, I use the word hero. I realize you were kind enough to put that, attach that to me, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that I think we don't have enough heroes that we draw upon in life. We don't draw upon exemplars enough. We don't draw upon what people have been through before and learning from them, whether it's through their art or through their biographies or whatever. And we don't talk so much in psychiatry and psychology about character. Character is one of those words that's just kind of dropped out because it sounds judgmental, it sounds all sorts of things. It takes away from the biological underpinnings of these, or seemingly takes away from the biological underpinnings of these illnesses. I don't think it does, but it can have that sense. But I think that discipline and character are what forge great art from brilliance. You can have great talent, you can have suffering, you can have experience, but if you haven't character, discipline, willpower, it doesn't get you so far. Poetry may come from an unhappy and disordered life, Lowell once wrote, but a huge amount of health has to go into the misery. Health, discipline, and courage. Without question, Lowell's attacks of mania spurred some of his finest work. They also brought terrible and lasting pain to him and to those he'd loved. Things he had done when he was manic, which were truly awful, haunted him when he had recovered, as did the terrifying certainty that it would all happen again. And indeed, his daughter was kind enough to give me access to his medical and psychiatric records, which you can imagine are pretty extensive given the number of hospitalizations. And time again in Lowell's records, he is terrified that he will go mad again. You know, it's very hard for people, we appreciate that with breast cancer, with heart attacks, that people are terrified, or with seizures, that people are terrified this will happen again. I think we don't focus so much on the terror that is involved in going psychotic again. Yet he came back from his madness and the inevitable depression that came in its wake, re-entered the fray of life, and kept intact his friendships. He kept his wit, he kept his capacity to love. He went back to work. Lowell's faculty for regeneration was extraordinary. It took unusual courage to face and to write from the certainty of impending madness. His poetic imagination was tethered to an unstable but fiercely disciplined mind. It forged his work and branded his life. Courage made his life and his work possible. He sought to understand in a very systematic and disciplined way something that he intuited early would be central to his life and work. From childhood on, he studied the lives and actions of courageous leaders, observed and emulated those whose bravery he admired. Lowell's intensely interested in what it meant to overcome fear and anxiety. Courage is usually discussed in the context of nerve on the battlefield or equanimity in facing death. But Lowell's courage in living with madness and suffering and the knowledge that they would come back were of a kin with the bravery shown by warriors that he knew and admired from Homer and Virgil, and from the clarity and the purpose and the moral vision and bravery he had found in his New England ancestors. Indeed, Yale, when it awarded Robert Lowell an honorary degree in 1968, cited him for his keen moral vision of his Pilgrim ancestors. He drew upon his ancestors. He learned from his ancestors. He wrote, he made metaphors. He did everything from people in history, people in poetry and literature, and people in life, and people in his past. In life, Robert Lowell was dealt a hand of cards exceedingly high in social privilege and in poetic imagination. But with them, he received dark cards, impossible to play, that broke him time and time again. There are no rules for how to play such cards. No one is provided a map to navigate madness or severe depression. Lowell played his cards with courage and imagination, and above all, he did not fold. It would have been easy to do so. What beyond his poetry even made him a hero to a great many people, wrote one of Lowell's students at Harvard, was the fact that living in the imminence of an internal chaos that would have wrecked many lives, he so often seemed stronger and not weaker than the normal person. In his steady and enormously ambitious work, which even illness could not interrupt, in his political courage, in the importance he gave to friendship, and in his ability to synthesize harsh truths with deeply felt values. Courage, Lord Moran, many of you may know Lord Moran for having written a memoir of Winston Churchill that was exceedingly indiscreet and very interesting. And he's the one who talked about Churchill's suicidal thoughts and going to the edge of the train and so forth. But Lord Moran was actually a man of great personal courage, and in the Battle of the Somme in the First War had actually gotten the Military Cross. He wrote a book on courage. And he said in his classic study of the psychological effects of war that courage is a moral quality. It is not a chance gift of nature like the aptitude for games. It is a cold choice between two alternatives: the fixed resolve not to quit, an act of renunciation which must be made not once, but many times by the power of will. Courage, he said, is willpower. Courage, he also believed, was the individual's exercise of mind over fear through self-discipline. Some individuals had deeper wells of willpower from which to draw courage, but all had limits on how often the well could be tapped. War drew deep. Courage was necessary to make it through the worst and most extreme conditions in life. War, madness, exploration of the unknown, the proximity to death. To discover and explore dangerous lands like battle required courage. So too did the greatest explorations that led to the greatest of art. The explorer, Apsley Garrard, who accompanied Captain Scott on his last Antarctic expedition, wrote an extraordinary book about it called The Worst Journey in the World. He described at length why some survive great stress, setback, terrifying circumstances of mind and body, and others do not. This was the subject of intense interest to Captain Scott as well. Both Cherry Garrard and Scott suffered throughout their lives from periods of severe depression. And indeed, in Cherry Garrard's case, psychotic depression, very psychotic depression. Yet, despite of or because of this, they forced themselves on and were great, great explorers, and I might add also, both of them, great writers. The man with the nerves goes farthest, Cherry Garrard said. What is the ratio between nervous and physical illness? What is vitality? Why do some things terrify you at one time and not at others? What is this early morning courage? He believed, as did Lord Moran, that deliberate willpower was the basis of courage. And like Moran, he believed that courage always, always had its limits. Some men who went to the South Pole were courageous beyond reckoning and endured what few could. Others did not. Always there was a price. In his own case, Cherry Garrard's case, he said there had been an overdraft on my vital capital, which I shall never quite pay off. In the case of 5 other men who went on Scott's expedition to the South Pole, including Scott, the price was death. Cherry Garrard was certain that Scott's sheer good-grained character, courage, grit, a sense of responsibility towards others, pulled him through not only the extremes of polar exploration, but also through the long bouts of his black moods. Surely Scott's greatest triumph, he said, as one explorer to another, was his conquest of his weaker self and his depression. That strength was the basis of his leadership and the reason his men came to love him. Scott's journey, in point of fact, was a moral one. We took risks. We knew we took them, Scott said, as he was dying. Things have come out against us, but we have no cause for complaint. Robert Lowell's character was the mix of icy nerve and ambition that Cherry Garrard and Lord Moran described in their writing about explorers and soldiers. Few prevail against mental illness as severe as Lowell's. Still fewer re-enter the mix of life, as he did time and time again. Insanity is a stress as extreme as being under fire or surviving the Antarctic cold. It demands energy and psychological reserves that most people do not and cannot have. It entails exposure to the world that most people do not feel they have, nor can they tolerate. The usual response is to redraw one's borders and lower one's expectations of life. To anyone who has been through mania or severe depression, this is a human and natural reaction to suffering. But Lowell did not do this. He had a virulent disease, but he had great capacity to form and keep his relationships, made it possible for him to continue his work, to love, to continue to fall in love, and to take what he learned from adversity into his poetry. He harvested what his illness had sown. One can learn and teach from the courage of poet and explorer. A disease, as Osler stressed, is not just a constellation of symptoms with a natural course. It is something that occurs to an individual, someone whose strengths and liabilities, as well as in character. It is these that determine how the disease is perceived, fought, and handled. I mean, obviously the nature of the disease is all determining, but it's also determined in part by character and personality. From childhood on, Lowell knew this and lived with dark swings in mood, with violence, with irrationality. He was used to hard going, and he learned from it early. Stability and conventional sanity never came easily to him. He did not expect a straight shot at life's difficult things. He knew from when he was young that art and life were hard, and he knew he would need courage. For inspiration, he went to the ancients, to Homer, Virgil, and other classical writers. He learned about valor from epic poets and studied the lives of warriors and leaders across the centuries. His was a deliberate approach to dealing with adversity, and in that lay the iron of his life and part of his strength to heal his mind. Alexander the Great, someone who in times of the grips of mania Lowell believed himself to be, had the greatness of heart to repent, he wrote, and repentance was a key. So too were the compassions that he received from others. He knew, most people who knew Lowell knew that he was a gentle, kind, generous person, generous to his students, generous to his friends and his family. And when he was manic, he was violent and abusive and simply awful. So one of the things I tried to deal with in my book, and I think is one of the things we a bit shy from in psychiatry is what are the moral issues of an illness that people don't sign up for? Lowell didn't ask for this illness. He hated it. He hated everything about it almost. And yet he did these terrible things to the people he most loved and most cared about. And one of his great concerns at the end of his life, he said, I would prefer to be dead than to do something that I know that I will remember that I did to somebody I loved. And yet the people in his life whom he damaged were really damaged by it. I mean, these were real damages, these real vicious attacks, particularly verbally, but occasionally physically. So the question is, what do we do with all of that? Who's responsible? It's not a disease that anybody wants to get. They get it. They do things that are terrible. Can you ever show enough remorse for that? It's unclear. Lowell, when he came to Yale shortly after Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, he said that, it was very important for students to realize that beneath this impetuous driving force of Robert Kennedy was a gentle person, and that he asked that people remember that in dealing with all these uncertainties when people are complex and can be terrible, as Robert Kennedy was known at that time by many people. It's the combination of the art of healing with science that makes psychiatry such an astonishing, difficult, and wonderful field. The science makes diagnosis, treatment, and ultimately prevention possible. Art brings understanding of the human condition into clinical practice, into teaching and research, hopefully, and into our lives. We can learn from the great and draw from their courage, from how they have dealt with adversity, how they have gone more difficult ways than most people do, and thought for themselves in the midst of it, how they have taken genuine risks, not just pseudo-risks, have failed and have gotten up again. My own struggles with mania and depression have convinced me to teach not only from clinical science, but from the lives and works of others. So I try to impress upon students and young doctors that tumult, if it is coupled to discipline and a cool mind, is not such a bad sort of thing. That unless one wants to live a stunningly boring life, one ought to be on good terms with one's darker side and one's darker energies. And above all, one should learn from turmoil and pain, share one's joy with those less joyful, and encourage passion when it promotes the common good. Knowledge is marvelous, but wisdom is even better. Thank you.